What is the difference between absolute and relative paths? A path is a string that specifies the location of a file or directory in a file system. In web development, paths let developers link to resources like images, style sheets, scripts, and other web pages. There are absolute and relative paths. Both are essential when specifying file locations within a file system. Let's look at the two so you can decide which one of them to use and when. An absolute path is a complete link to a resource. It starts from the root directory, includes every other directory, and finally the file name and extension. The root directory refers to the top-level directory or folder in a hierarchy. An absolute path also includes the protocol, which could be HTTP, HTTPS, and file, and the domain name if the resource is on the web. Here is an example of an absolute path that links to the FreeCodeCamp logo. In this example, the protocol is HTTPS. The domain name is designstyleguide.freecodecamp.org, and the file name is fcc_secondary_small.svg. Now, what if the resource you want to link to using an absolute path is on your local machine? Imagine I have the following folder structure on my machine. Here's how to link to the about.html file with an absolute path. It looks like this because we are going into a folder on my computer called users, then into a folder called user, then into a folder called desktop, then into a folder called FCC, then into a folder called script code, and then we are in this project, which in itself is a folder called absolute versus relative paths, then into the folder called pages to finally get the about.html file. Phew! Here's what the absolute URL looks like in a browser address bar. The URL includes the protocol, so file : //. It also includes the path, which looks like this and represents the series of folders that lead to the file. And finally, it also includes the about.html, which is the file name and the extension. Now let's look at the relative path. A relative path specifies the location of a file relative to the directory of the current file. It does not include the protocol or the domain name, making it shorter and more flexible for internal links within the same website. Let's go back to the same file structure. Here is an example of linking to the about.html page from the contact.html page. So imagine you're on the contact.html page, and because the about.html page is in the same place, we simply get the file name. This is an example of using a relative file path. So, which should you use and when? An absolute path or a relative path? Here are the rules you should follow. Use absolute paths when linking to a resource hosted on an external website. Use absolute paths when you need to link to a page or resource to work consistently, regardless of the document location within the site. And use relative paths when linking to resources within the same website. Also use relative paths if you want to keep your code cleaner and easier to maintain during development. And finally, also use relative paths during local testing to ensure links work without an internet connection.